Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very first edition of Talking Europeum in English. My name is Christian Forning Lassen. I'm the Deputy Director of Europeum, Institute for European Policy. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by our dear research fellow, Daniel Piacevic. I hope I got that right.
Janskevich, but so close. No problem.
So close. My apologies. And today we're going to be talking about something not directly related to Europe and the EU, but nonetheless very relevant, because we're going to be talking about the upcoming US elections. And I think we ended up titling this podcast, The Tale of Two Elections, courtesy of you, Daniel, because having recently seen both the Democratic National Convention and now being on the cusp of ending the Republican National Convention, it's an opportune time to take stock at what the US elections might mean, not just for Europe, but also on a more global and, of course, on an American scale. And as the title indicates, A Tale of Two Elections underscores division and fragmentation that we have seen recently over the past 4 years in US politics under Donald Trump. And the two respective conventions have taken place against the backdrop, of course, of the coronavirus pandemic and also protests related not just to the Black Lives Matter movement, but also protests against the other domestic issues, such as the alleged voter suppression conducted by the Republicans through making reforms or changes at the US Postal Service. And all in all, going into the elections, it looks like Biden has an extremely comfortable lead, but as we also witnessed in 2016, that might be deceptive. Of course, have wide-reaching ramifications both on domestic issues within the US, but also in terms of foreign policy. And this podcast will attempt to tackle both within a reasonable time limit. We might have been a bit overambitious in the topics we want to touch upon, but we are nonetheless going to make an honest attempt. So in terms of foreign policy topics, which we will take after the domestic ones, we'll of course discuss the difference between the Biden and Harris campaign versus Trump-Pence administration on climate and energy. We're going to be touching upon the coronavirus response, of course, because that's unavoidable given the current situation, especially in the US. And of course, we're also going to be touching on defense, diplomacy, and international relations, because ultimately that is what affects all of us across the pond as well. So going into the domestic issues particularly, but also talking about the main issues and the state of play in the US elections, Danielle, having recently, if not witnessed, then at least kept tabs on and followed the two respective national conventions. What struck you as the most cardinal differences between the two party platforms that were on display?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks for having me. So I will also just preface that I think I'm the resident American in the office, so I'm happy to kind of put that hat on today. So I'm having a little bit of flashbacks to obviously 2016, not necessarily in the conventions, but kind of in the days leading up to it and the months before. I moved to DC actually after being in Europe for about 6 years, and I came there about 2 months before the US election. So to a very different DC than I expected. So I have my my apprehensions going into this next election. And then after watching and viewing the two conventions, I can just say that we basically are in two different realities. The stark differences, not just in rhetoric, but in how the speakers are approaching just the reality of where the United States is currently at. DNC focused on how the pandemic has and will shape the US's future, stressed the importance of science, democracy, and human decency, and highlighted a united Democratic Party platform, which I think is really key. Whereas the RNC so far, I'm going to kind of call it a Trump party, has been taking a bit more a divisive angle and playing a little bit more of a blaming game on kind of the current situations that are taking place and taking hold in the United States. A lot of finger pointing and unfortunately rhetoric, and just undermining the democratic process of the system in place. I know we'll touch on the election kind of integrity in a little bit, but the one thing I will give the RNC is that I think they had a decent representation of women so far, even though most held the Trump last name, but a clear lack of diversity, I think is just clear across the board, and I think it just showcased the alternative reality that the Trump campaign is living in compared to Biden.
Yeah, my main takeaway, especially from the after seeing the Republican National Convention, was, as you say, this parallel reality or this lack of consensus on what is actually happening fundamentally within the country. You saw at the Republican National Convention that someone like Larry Kudlow was basically speaking about the pandemic in past tense, even though on the very same day that he spoke, more than 1,000 Americans had died. A trend that has been going on pretty much ever since the outbreak of the pandemic. And as you mentioned, it didn't seem like a traditional party convention or a political convention. And I think we also have to wonder whether that signifies if the Republican Party has basically devolved into being a personality cult of Trump, as opposed to an actual party.
Absolutely. I think it was a show targeting the right audience. They knew exactly who their audience was, and they had all the right tones and the right messages that they know that their voters want to hear. I think the platform in itself, the fact that we have had to move to a bit more of a virtual space for these conventions, also will kind of trigger kind of how we receive and perceive information. And I think disinformation is going to be really rampant coming up to the elections. And I think if the fact that the convention is a platform for this just really elevates it to another level. So I think that's going to be a big issue. And one thing that we can kind of see is that Trump's tactic to create doubt in the voters, and I know you mentioned that in the beginning, for the mail-in and creating confusion when it comes to accessing the polls. The sentiment doesn't quite match reality of what voters are actually perceiving. Pew came out with a report back in April surveying actually Republicans that came in over 80% were in favor of mail-in voting, and actually 75% thought it would be done fairly and democratically. So I'm not quite sure from that issue that I took away from a lot of the rhetoric around the convention is that this is going to be a fraudulent process, but his voters actually don't feel that way. I mean, the statistics are there. I can actually personally say, being abroad for 2 elections, including this upcoming one, I can personally say that mail-in voting is actually very easy and straightforward. And I kind of jokingly say that if you can do your taxes online, you can handle this. So it's not, just doesn't quite match the reality that as he was creating, and that his the speakers were. And I know you mentioned, but for on the domestic side, I think the areas that we're really going to have to dissect coming up to the elections are going to be race, health, and economy. I think these are certainly be large issues that need to be addressed for the rest of the campaign. And unfortunately, these are going to be also the single policy issues that a lot of American voters are going to run on. And I think as we move into kind of the foreign policy discussion, these are going to be the root of everything, is how does this affect me personally and at home?
Definitely. And as you also mentioned, much of what has been made of fraudulent mail-in voting has been challenged extensively. It's been challenged in courts as well, where the Trump campaign has been asked to provide proof of fraudulent mail-in voting. I believe it was in Pennsylvania where they had to go to trial for a case there, and given that they had no evidence of it, the trial was dismissed. But nevertheless, as you mentioned, I hesitate to say Republican Party straight up, but especially Trump's Republican Party seemed very intent on creating this parallel reality where the election is going to be stolen due to fraud, particularly pertaining to mail-in voting. But as you also mentioned, that's not something that necessarily resonates with most Republican voters. So it almost seems a bit as if either Trump is acting like he doesn't want to win, or he is planning what some is saying will be an October surprise, a bit like when Comey jumped the investigation on Hillary to change it. But on a deeper level, doesn't it also raise a concern that we might see the dismantling of American democracy fundamentally? Because for a candidate being as far behind as Trump is, and that is after pollsters learned from the 2016 mistakes, it seems almost inconceivable, bearing a miracle or a nightmare, depending on your point of view, that he's gonna be able to win the upcoming election. And
I would say, oh, sorry, go on.
No, sorry, go on.
I was just gonna say, Christian, what you brought up is exactly, we could have had this conversation before 2016 as well, where Trump also came out saying that if Hillary ended up winning, he would actually challenge it. He might not let down. And I think that's incredibly interesting now that Hillary Clinton actually just recently came out saying that if the vote is too close, that Biden should absolutely fight the decision and make it go down to kind of the last minute decision. Don't let the election kind of roll out that evening, because the issue is that Trump is going to already is planting that seed of doubt that whatever happens, somehow there's a conspiracy against him and there's something wrong. But I think we can also directly parallel this to kind of the disinformation and the election interference that we saw with Russia. It's just now being used domestically. So these are exact same, I know people are throwing the word the playbook that Russia created, but now it's actually being used domestically and internally. And this is nothing new. I know we see this across Europe. We've kind of covered some other elections here, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. But I think to the level that the United States is kind of moving forward with this is quite shocking. So that will really, I think, kind of set the tone for how the US has to also navigate post-elections. We're no longer the golden standard of how elections should be implemented and carried out. And I think that's something to be of great concern.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, especially against this backdrop of not just racial tensions, but fundamentally human tensions. Because, of course, you've had Black Lives Matter, but you've also had other protests, some of them being against masks and mostly by people bringing their guns. But you've also had protests against the gradual dismantling of the US Postal Service, which even predates this election campaign cycle, because that also, of course, ties into the Republican pension reform on the US Postal Service. But coupled with the coronavirus pandemic, you potentially have a very explosive mixture that could easily escalate in a scenario where you have the election night. Not all votes are counted due to many of them being by mail and having to be sorted, but Trump nonetheless.
From abroad.
Yeah, also from abroad, also your vote.
Yeah, my vote.
Yeah. Maybe that's going to be the deciding one.
I hope so.
Yeah, but if you then have a scenario where Trump proclaims himself winner on the election night, even if the numbers show something else, then, as you mentioned, by creating this fundamental doubt or relativizing everything, essentially creating parallel realities where at least a segment of the Republicans are saying that if we don't win, it's due to fraud, then obviously your democratic system has some fundamental problems that aren't just going to be solved by changing a candidate, even though it would be a welcome change. But you need to rediscover some kind of consensus within society that has been lost due to this division and polarization and fragmentation. Do you believe Biden would potentially be the one? Because he's very often framed as a bridge builder between the Republican and Democrat Party. Do you think he would be the one to build bridges or heal the nation, as some people are fond of saying?
Yeah, no, I mean, it would definitely take a Biden and Harris combo, and I think that's why the strategic decision, and I'm a big fan of Harris, being, a California native myself. I think it's how they pave and the policies that they've already actually spoke about. So kind of their post-COVID recovery is really putting it all in on making sure that we slow down the spread and kind of get the economy building up again, but gradually. And I think that's going to be really key. Something that I think will have to be addressed, and this goes back to kind of the race relations and also health and economy, is that, often when you have a common enemy, you can also help bridge the divide. And I think battling coronavirus should be that. I mean, what better issue to unite us is on something that's not necessarily a foreign enemy, but something that we can create some tools to kind of rebuild and then use to kind of jumpstart the economy, make sure that people kind of have access to, fair and equal healthcare system. I mean, these are things that need to be addressed, but to use it under the framework of coronavirus might actually be the issue that, unites us all. And I think he would have a clear, a better path, because unfortunately, I mean, Trump has already had this opportunity. This isn't something like, let's wait for another 4 years. He's already just had the last, half a year to deal with this. And where are we now? So I think it's kind of, they say the proof is in the pudding. So I think we're definitely already seeing what should have been done. And I mean, honestly, could it get worse? That's another question.
Yeah, that's let's hope it won't get worse. Mm-hmm. But you do raise a very good point. Actually, two very good points. First of all, the common enemy, which unfortunately seems to be something every society needs, or at least they need a challenge to overcome. And there you not only have the coronavirus, you actually also have climate change, which we're going to be touching upon in a moment when we move on to concrete policy topics. But that is an even more existential threat that Biden and Harris actually does have a plan to tackle. Whereas, as you mentioned, much like coronavirus, Trump has had 4 years, even though he's acting like he hasn't had a single year. Mm-hmm. Potentially also why at the Republican National Convention, the people started chanting 8 or even 12 more years, even though it blatantly goes against the Constitution.
Pull a Putin, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, that's another funny thing with Republicans also always being very keen on sticking to the institution, but when it applies to them, they don't seem as keen on it. Excellent. But anyway, that can also be attributed to Trump's radicalization. But anyway, as I think we're at a good point where we can move on to more concrete topics, and what better to start with than climate and energy, because as you already alluded to, we need some common challenges at least to overcome, and there is arguably none greater than climate change. And here the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is stark, to say the least. Biden and Harris has acknowledged it as the greatest threat we're facing, whereas the Trump administration has termed it a hoax and cast doubt on its very existence. And so very much along the lines that we're seeing generally between the Democrat and the Republican Party, you have science against wishful thinking. Talking about climate change and climate and energy policy in particular, what has struck you most about the Harris and Biden proposals, but also if you want to briefly outline it, maybe it would be helpful to our listeners.
Absolutely. So I'm glad you brought it up, because it's going to be incredibly important, and one of those kind of invisible enemies that I think, once again, kind of, if given the right tools and the right person, can be actually a uniting force. So Biden and Harris actually released a plan to reduce emissions and invest in new technology and infrastructure. It's called the Clean Energy Revolution, which will get the U.S. up to speed on addressing these issues. But most importantly, and this is the area I want to highlight, is that he links the environment to economy. Europe has actually rolled out similar plans to potentially link the two and to further establish these areas. And especially as we've kind of faced a long economic recovery because of COVID, I mean, trying to find additional ways that can also be beneficial to the environment, I mean, it makes so much sense. So if, kind of looking to our partners in Europe to kind of see the best practices. And one area that I think contrasts, and this I can allude a little bit more to Europe's case on this, is that Trump's policies haven't really been necessarily clear, and it's always been focused on undoing previous policies in place and to kind of move towards more fossil fuel friendly processes and programs. And I think this is the big stark difference between the two, is that the voter base he's targeting, of course, are many of those whose jobs rely on these sources. And instead of focusing and shifting towards cleaner energy, he's actually creating more divisions. And it goes without saying that Europe also is facing similar challenges, and Central and Eastern Europe, I think, is a prime example of that. But what Europe was able to do is create incentives for these countries to kind of reduce these, and then try to find ways to reinvest in cleaner and more renewable energy sources. So I mean, I think just taking examples from there could be the best way forward. And I think that's what Biden's actually already alluding to. So kind of strengthening that transatlantic relationship and best practices. I mean, I think that's the biggest difference, is that there is a plan in place.
Yeah, that's we already alluded to this earlier, talking about how the Republican National Convention actually didn't have a party platform this year. Yeah. It was basically, we're supporting what Trump is saying and doing. So obviously there is no plan, just like there was no plan for the pandemic, which we will get to in a moment. But speaking about those two fundamentally different views, and also in light of the economic downturn, which has also impacted fossil fuel industries and jobs quite extensively, accelerating for instance, the decommissioning of coal as an energy source, and also accelerating the transition away from oil even, if we follow the projections. It begs the question, because Trump was speaking about preserving coal mining jobs and other fossil fuel jobs in 2016. But in 2016, there were only 80,000 people employed in coal mines in the US. That's less than what Walmart employs, to provide a reference. But given the economic trends, how much will this actually appeal to his base? Because the number of people employed in these sectors is generally shrinking, and the projections for the retaining of these jobs is also looking worse and worse. So
I would even go a step further, Christian, because I would also say that most of these states, I mean, they're going to be swing states as well. I mean, these are states that actually do matter. So if he's not able to harness the voters that he, was relying on, that can go either way. I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. I would also say these are also areas that have been hard hit by coronavirus. So these go hand in hand. And so I think, I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's going to be something that we have to look closely on. And if he's not able to harness those voters, the question is, will Biden and Harris be able to do so? And I think by almost just creating clear paths of how to move forward through not just energy kind of policies, but also post-corona policies, I think that will be a way to show people that they have some way forward.
Definitely. Rounding off this climate and energy section, what a lot of progressives, both in Europe and the US, has been wondering about was whether Biden and Harris, and if so, to what extent, they would incorporate parts of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's platforms, because they were generally regarded as the most ambitious in terms of tackling climate change, and also evinced by the popularity of AOC and her proposal for the Green New Deal. Can you tell to which extent that Sanders and Warren has had an impact on Biden and Harris's policies?
I think by them showing support of Biden and Harris, as nominees, I think that will show that they clearly are trying to absorb some of these policies in general. But I actually don't know to what extent these have been put into concrete policy platform positions. But I can imagine just, on the trail, this will continue to come out. And I do have hope that, of course, in the next administration, if it's a Biden administration, that these people will have positions that can help also put these ideas into motion as well. Yeah,
definitely. All right. So moving on to coronavirus, which we already talked a bit about. As you mentioned, the Trump administration has no plan. That, of course, makes it a bit hard to talk about what their actual policies were or are. Whereas Biden and Harris not only has a plan, but Biden has been very vocally criticizing the Trump administration for completely disregarding the pandemic response plan that the Obama and Biden administration left them. And furthermore, Joe Biden, as recently as October 2019, raised awareness that the US wouldn't be prepared for a pandemic due to Trump basically dismantling the CDC's pandemic response team. I don't think Biden expected to be as prescient as that was, but it goes to show also the difference between having a seasoned lawmaker who actually plans for eventualities, whereas Trump's very often wrong gut instinct ends up wreaking havoc. But anyway, speaking of the coronavirus, do you want to quickly sketch out the two divides that we're facing, because they are as night and day as can possibly be?
Yeah. I think whoever has to, even if it's a Trump for the next 4 years, I think whatever the next administration has to deal with, coronavirus is going to be the number one, because it has so many linkages within economy, healthcare system. It's going to even go into our geopolitical positioning in the world. It's going to have so many ramifications. There actually is a clear policy that Biden and Harris has come out with, and as I mentioned earlier, has linkages to economic recovery. And I think just the fact that Biden has also gone through a financial crisis with Obama, the fact that they have kind of seen how to create these structures in place to move forward is going to be vital. And once again, this isn't new. Trump has had the opportunity to already kind of work through these. And unfortunately, I'm just not hearing. He has time to come out with these policies. And I think that's going to be a lot on the debates. So that's something definitely to look forward when we see the debates kick off in the end of September, leading up to the elections. it's going to probably be number one. So I can't really paint too much of a difference because they're just, unfortunately, the information is still so fluid. But I think we should definitely keep it and continue to look at how other countries are dealing with it too. Not saying that China should be wrote off as, how they dealt with it, but also other European countries, other democracies, to kind of really see how you can keep this in place and keep your economy moving forward.
Yeah, certainly not least by not politicizing the crisis, which I think for many people is probably one of the most perplexing things to come out of the Trump administration, and God knows there are a lot of them to choose from. But if Trump had basically just taken it seriously, that could be a guaranteed re-election right there. Mm-hmm. But he ended up choosing not to. You also touch upon a different thing, namely that Biden, courtesy of having been vice president under Obama, has experience in navigating a societal crisis, in Biden's case, financial crisis. It does allude to a broader pattern, though, where it seems like whenever Democrats enter power, they inherit a crisis from the previous administration. In Clinton's case, it was an oil crisis and high levels of unemployment. In Obama's case, it's a financial crisis. If Biden gets elected, now it's going to be the coronavirus pandemic. Mm-hmm. What we generally tend to see, though, when Democrats inherit a crisis from Republicans, and it always does seem to happen, is that in the subsequent midterm elections, the Democrats usually carry the brunt of the blame for it, either due to short memory amongst the population, or due to effective politicization or narratives from the Republican side. So, however, in 2018, we also saw a blue wave sweep over the US in the midterm elections. Do you expect, or would you venture or hazard a guess whether or not we might see something similar in the 2022 midterms, where Republicans might once again end up in a situation where they can essentially hamstring the sitting president and keep him somewhat passive?
Oh, I mean, part of me wants to say, I mean, it's just inevitable. It most likely will happen. I think the big difference we're going to see is whatever happens in these elections, the division between the Republican parties are just going to continue within the political party itself will continue to divide. So the question is, like, which group of Republicans will be the ones targeting? Will it be kind of the Trump-led Republicans, or will it be kind of the Republicans that have been moving a little bit more center and who are trying to help bridge this divide that is created over the last 4 years? So I think that's really what we're going to have to kind of look out for, to see what kind of divisions and group kind of lead the way in the Republican Party, and try to rebuild it as well. I mean, it definitely needs to kind of be restructured.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, there is a group, an increasingly vocal group of Republicans who try to distance themselves from Trump. Even to the extent that they had a parallel Republican National Convention, as well as several prominent Republicans, such as John Cage, being part of the Democratic National Convention and endorsing Biden. So yeah, I mean, coronavirus has probably not split the Republican Party all by itself, but it has definitely been the straw that broke the camel's back under existing fault lines within the party, where you have a very radical wing and you have a more traditionally Republican wing who wouldn't be averse to bridge building. Absolutely.
And I think in contrast, you see then the Democratic Party being more unified than they have actually in the past. So this is kind of in contrast to that, which I think is very interesting compared to the 2016 elections.
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats have managed, in large part thanks to opposition to Trump as well, managed to unify in diversity. Because as you also mentioned in the beginning, the Democratic National Convention showcased an actual America, an America which is diverse and pluralist, and under demographic developments, changing away from being primarily white into being more mixed, and they have managed to unite. Whether or not that unity will last beyond Trump, we're just going to have to see. But definitely they have seemed much stronger than they were in 2016, where Hillary never really managed to get the progressive wing of the Democratic Party on board. Whereas this year, even Bernie Sanders and many ardent Bernie Sanders supporters have rallied behind the Biden-Harris campaign.
Mm-hmm. But one thing I will caution, and I brought this up actually right when Harris had actually been the official nominee for vice president, is that, well, once again, big, huge fan, but we're also seeing the divide within even kind of the subset of the United States, where she's representing a coastal kind of more elitist town. So you also have that where, you know, yes, people will be able to resonate with her and being from Oakland and these areas, but the idea that then you still have the issue of kind of the middle America that still feels very disenfranchised and, you know, are also subject to socioeconomic divisions. But I think we're going to have to kind of look beyond that and just look at the bigger picture of, like, you know, what kind of the United States do we want to live in the next 4 years? Yeah,
and that choice increasingly seems to, and I hesitate to use this word, but if all the reports coming out of Russian election interference aided and abetted by the Trump cult and all the corruption going on, you might end up with the choice between a democratic or a fascist America, even though that...
It's being used against the Democratic Party actually at the moment. So interesting that you said that. But I completely agree. I think we're going to see that, like I mentioned earlier, that it's now kind of a domestic issue. So it's going to be harder to separate the truth from the untruths. And I think that's something that we're going to have to be just as more informed voters and really look to, and I keep saying this, is kind of our European allies and make sure that we can also rebuild the transatlantic relationship that I have to admit has been kind of fell to the wayside in the last 4 years. With that political vacuum that's being created, I mean, Russia and China are going to be the first ones and have been the first ones to enter that, and who are actually, you know, as we kind of refrain from adhering to some of like the multilateral parties or the systems in place, I think we're going to have to kind of play, you know, double time to get caught up and kind of see, put United States back on kind of as the standard for, you know, democratic values. But if not in the next 4 years, then just know that it's going to happen. Somebody else is going to step in. So this is kind of like a forewarning, I think, that to all of my American friends who are watching, it's just, you know, and also for Europeans, I mean, it's something that we need to be very concerned about moving forward.
Yeah, because this also affects us in Europe and indeed every single country in the world. Whether or not the US becomes an authoritarian or at least an adversary regime, or whether or not it maintains the pre-Trump status quo under Obama, it's gonna have a very wide impact on every single country in the world, and obviously, as you mentioned, if the US becomes an adversary and if transatlantic relations become even more eroded than they have been so far, that creates a very large power vacuum that other players, you mentioned China and Russia, but arguably you could also argue whether or not the EU should attempt to fill this power vacuum, at least in some respects. But it does raise a question on who will come out on top in this geopolitical competition. And I think right now, if we're being absolutely honest about it, it will probably be China, given both the internal divisions within the EU, where we had Brexit recently, also in 2016. We have a rising right-wing extremist slash populist challenge to overcome here within Europe as well. And we have an increasingly emboldened Russia, who seem to be mastering the art of both cyber and covert warfare. Mm-hmm. So obviously a lot is on the line, but if we look at it from a European perspective, even if Biden and Harris wins, it's going to take a long time to recover from the 4 years of havoc that Trump has wreaked on the transatlantic relations and the fundamental trust that has been broken from the US side, also by pulling out of the Paris Agreement and the Open Skies Treaty. And
just keep naming them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, if I keep naming everything that's been smashed, then we're going to be here for a long time.
But I think it also serves as a bit of hope that when the next administration does come in, a lot of these are not set in stone, that can be reversed, or new policies can be implemented that reflect a little bit more of our times. Because I mean, I understand that there were some valid reasons for some of the removals of these programs, or maybe upgrading them or changing them. But I think it doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist. I think they need to also adapt with the times. And I think as we go into like a post-COVID recovery time, these programs and kind of international partnerships are going to be more important now than ever. And if it means kind of a revitalization, what better time than with a new administration and time to kind of renegotiate the policies. So I'm trying to be optimistic on this front. And I think that things can't be, these are not permanent changes, that things can be changed. The good work that has been done in the Obama administration and prior to that can kind of reformulate itself as it kind of has to reshape for these next coming years. That will be challenging nonetheless, but I think we're really going to have to see how these elections play out. And like I said, the debates are going to be very interesting, and maybe we can check in again on this podcast after one of the debates. But it would be, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I completely agree with you that what better time than to update or revise some of these initiatives that are by now either a couple of years old or even much older. For instance, the Paris Agreement is probably already too late to even be adhered to, due to accelerating climate change. So updating that, upping the ambitions, that it would definitely be an opportune time right now. Also because, as you mentioned, coronavirus has changed reality also economically in terms of opting for renewable solutions.
I would say look at the programs that came out kind of post-Cold War, and when democracies had to be rebuilt. I mean, we're going to be dealing with, not necessarily to that same level, but I mean, a post-pandemic is pretty drastic. So think of the programs that can be shaped after that in need, that have direct need in not just the United States, but abroad. I mean, this could be also an area of opportunity to really develop those. And as I said, could be also a catalyst for kind of healing some of the divisions, not just in the transatlantic relationship, but also domestically.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it seems very much like a missed opportunity for especially the Trump administration, who under their watch had the opportunity to actually replace the old with something new. But as you also mentioned earlier, it seems more important for Trump to simply undo things rather than create something different in response to it. And as you also mentioned, even though you might not be satisfied with the current agreements, they are still very much needed. But maybe that also points to Trump attempting to appeal to his base. You mentioned the Middle America earlier. Maybe societal segments that hasn't had benefit, or at least hasn't perceived any benefit from globalization and multilateralism. And that potentially is a more fundamental problem that needs to be tackled, whether or not globalization can actually be made to work for everyone.
It just needs a better PR. I think, I mean, I don't think people understand to what extent. And I think the trade wars with China was a prime example of people realizing, wow, this actually does affect even our domestic farming. I mean, just down to where we store things. I mean, it was amazing to see how people realize that these really have the global ramifications, have, homegrown effects. I think it needs to be spun and focused a little bit more. I mean, I know foreign policy is typically not the hot topic that's, debated during election periods.
But Except I think, for us.
Yeah, for us, yeah. And are probably the people listening. But I think when you're looking at who the actual voters are, like I said, single policy issues, that how does this affect me at home directly? So it really is going to take Biden and Harris to really tailor these messages to those people as well, and kind of just remind them that, when something happens across the world, it does have a direct effect. And that's why these, international relationships are incredibly vital, especially in a globalized world, whether we like it or not.
Definitely. And a bit the same with the EU, but that's a discussion that's for a different podcast and a discussion for another time. I think before we round off, we already touched a bit upon the economy, because you mentioned the trade war and the fledgling realization that things that happen abroad has a very tangible impact at home. So far during Trump's tenure, during his first term as president, the one enduring myth or perception among society is that Trump is strong on the economy, is stronger than anyone else because he's a businessman. How does that jive with not just the current economic reality during the pandemic, which is of course terrible? It can't be stressed how bad it is enough. But also beforehand, how much would you say Trump has actually accomplished compared to what he inherited from the Obama and Biden administration, who started out from a very bad situation with the financial crisis, but ended up with a very strong economy?
So not being an economist myself, mine's just more of my perception of what I've been seeing and obviously hearing, especially in the convention and also the upcoming elections debates. But I would say I completely agree. I mean, it's basically he's riding off the kind of the tidal wave of the 8 years that an Obama and Biden presidency has put in to kind of recover from the financial crisis. And the things that have been put in place, I mean, so Trump has been able to kind of continue on to those. And now when confronted with a situation where it impacts the economy directly and head on, we see that there clearly was no clear policy and plan in place, besides some very drastic ones that I know he did very early on, that were able to uphold a crisis. And not saying that, who else could have handled that differently. I mean, we're going to have to see in the next 4 years. But I think it just really showcased that the internal policies just weren't there. And I've yet to kind of hear clear and coherent policies from kind of the Trump and Pence campaign right now to hear like how they plan to move forward. I mean, they just keep saying it's the best and that they've really rebuilt it, but from something that was already doing fine. So I think once again, it's the rhetoric that they're trying to showcase, painting a picture that we were in a really dire situation before. Not saying that we are definitely in a dire situation now, but before, I mean, make America great. But then I know people alluded this before, but was not America not great before? Like, we really have to think, are we better in a place now than we were before? And I know that's been quoted and I said it already, but I think that's at the end of the day, how the voters and kind of international partners are really going to have to look.
Yeah. Whether America was great before, obviously, it depends on who you ask. But looking at the at the current situation, I think it would be disingenuous for anyone to claim that America was or is better than it was before. And I mean, looking at the economy, I'm reading a study right now where it shows that the quarterly GDP growth under Obama's second term and Trump is pretty much equal, but Obama generated roughly 30,000 additional jobs per month than Trump has done. So obviously, even on economic parameters, Trump is generally doing worse than Obama. Mm-hmm. But as you also mentioned, we keep circling back to this problem of parallel reality, something that is not only inherent to the US, but which is also inherent to many countries in Europe. You have Britain with Brexit, which was largely influenced by disinformation from the Vote Leave campaign. You have countries in Central and Eastern Europe where, once again, invisible enemies, be it migrants or LGBTQ people, are framed as existential threats and enemies to the average citizen. Of course, it's hard to gauge what exactly is the cause of this, whether social media or the ease of and the speed of information transfer plays a part. But ultimately, it's a problem that is needed to be tackled, not just within the US, but also within Europe, also within any other country. To round off on a bit more philosophical level or free thinking level, do you have any ideas on how this general societal polarization or this competition for narratives can be bridged or mitigated somehow?
I mean, it's leadership, strong leadership. I think both what you've described that's been occurring in Europe, from the early 2000s to kind of now. I think if you have a strong leader and that represents a little bit more the middle of kind of the left and the right, if you will, that's really what you need moving forward. So kind of like a bridge builder, not a divider. So I mean, that's, I know it's very philosophical and it sounds very fancy, but I think in the end of the day, it goes back to strong leadership and partnership. And I think that's really important. I think if you look back at the kind of the strong presidential leaders that have had to deal with, global situations in the US's history, all of them actually chose very strong foreign policies towards strong transatlantic relations. And I think by going against that, you're actually going against what the fabric of the United States was created and has built up to this point. So it's incredibly important to move forward on that note. And I think we're at a point where we can make that decision by voting democratically and fairly. So I think it's really important that we use that knowledge going forward.
Definitely. And to end it off, if any US people are listening, please remember to register. Please remember to vote in good time and check that your ballot has arrived.
Absolutely. I've already received my email back saying that they received my mail, my absentee voting from abroad. So it's easy. It's very comprehensive. So really important to do so. And I think, do your democratic duty.
Democratic and civic duty. And to all of you listening and who might have stakes in this election, best of luck. No matter your convictions, I hope you will end up happy, but also understand that democracy is inherently about compromise and not always getting your own way. So, even though that is, of course, the nicest. Danielle, thank you so much for bringing not only your American perspective, but also a very broad and international one, courtesy of your fascinating background and your extensive travels throughout your life, and of course your expertise and sharp wit. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
One final question, since you just relocated to Brussels. from the Czech Republic. What do you prefer, Czech or Belgian beer?
Oh, wait, but this might be the dividing. I have to say I'm a big Czech beer fan. So, but I guess what? You can find it here in Belgium, so it's all fine.
Thank you, globalization and the EU.
Indeed. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Take care.
Bye.